Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. This week, I am covering the murder of Alexandra Pesic. A few weeks back, I did a collaboration with Stuart Blues on his podcast, British Murders. This is the story I told. But I wanted to make sure my listeners got a chance to hear it as well, because it's wild. This case takes place in the late 80s, early 90s, so you can paint a picture in your head. Let's start with a little background on Zandra. Her family immigrated to Canada from Yugoslavia when she was a young girl. Zandra was very popular throughout her school years, both because of her personality and good looks. Her friends convinced her to enter a local beauty pageant. She did it more for shits and giggles, but ended up winning first place. Then she went on to compete for the title of Miss Canada. She didn't come out on top there, but it was a fun experience. After high school, she attended school to become a dental assistant. Zandra's best friend was her mom. One of their favorite things to do together was attend open houses. Neither of them were in the market to buy. It was just fun to pretend and get the scoop on the neighborhood. One day, Zandra and her mother were doing their open house thing, and as they loaded up on free snacks, they spoke to each other in their native tongue, Serbo-Croatian. It wasn't a common language in Canada, so they could basically have their own secret conversations in public, which came in handy when crashing open houses. But at this particular open house, there was another woman who recognized the language, Alexandra Pesic. She approached Zandra and her mother. She introduced herself and started speaking in Serbo-Croatian. She, too, immigrated from Yugoslavia. Jelka wasn't in the market for a house either. She was just being snoopy and checking out the homes in the area. They all had a laugh about their idea of fun. The three of them really hit it off. All being from the same country, they had a lot in common. Jelka asked Zandra if she was single, which was a bit forward, but she had a son around her age and thought they would be a perfect match. Zandra laughed it off. She wasn't necessarily on the hunt for a partner. If it happened, it happened. She wasn't too keen on being set up. Jelka said her family owned an auto body shop, Sam & Sons, because her husband's name is Sam. She gave Zandra a business card and said if she ever had car trouble, it would be on the house. And if she ever stopped in, she would be happy to introduce Zandra to her son, Joe. Literally the very next day, Zandra's car started acting up. There was something making a clanking noise under the hood. She remembered the business card and Jelka's offer. Sam & Sons Auto Body Shop was only a few blocks away, so she drove straight there and Jelka was delighted to see her. She greeted Zandra with a big hug and said, "I can't wait to introduce you to Joe." Jelka told the mechanics to put her car at the front of the line and drag Zandra into the office. There, Jelka introduced her to Joe. Despite her hesitance to be forced into the situation, Zandra was quite pleased with what she saw in front of her. She found Joe very handsome. He had a very polished look, wearing a suit and sporting an 80s mustache. As polished as an 80s mustache can be. So, when Jelka kept pushing for them to go on a date, she figured, why not? After that first date, Joe and Zandra were inseparable. Joe was a flashy guy. He took her on dates to the most upscale restaurants in town and dancing at the club. When they weren't out on the town, they were riding on his motorcycle. After only knowing each other for a month, Joe asked Zandra to marry him, and she said yes. She had already told her friends and family she knew he was the one. While Zandra seemed to know Joe pretty well after just 4 short weeks, she hadn't spent much time with Joe's immediate family outside of meeting Jelka at the open house. She had no idea that Jelka was the monster of all monster-in-laws. She knew Jelka was a bit overbearing. I mean, she didn't take no for an answer when introducing Zandra to her son, but it turned out Jelka was right in that instance. They were perfect for each other. But Zandra did not understand how controlling Yelka was until the wedding planning came along. Wedding planning should be up to the bride and groom, a fun experience to let your personality show on your special day. But Yelka had a vision and didn't hold back by telling Zandra where to get married, how to decorate, what food to serve, and, gasp, what to wear. Zandra had enough and spoke up. She told Yelka that it was her wedding and she was going to make the decisions. Yelka said Zandra was marrying her son. She wanted it to be the best and she knew how to make that happen. So what do you do at this point? You stand up for yourself and basically get told no by your soon-to-be mother-in-law. I think I would be second-guessing the whole marriage, to be honest. Zandra had a talk with Joe, who unfortunately was actually quite the mama's boy. He didn't want to stand up to Yelka. Zandra threatened to call the whole thing off if he didn't say something to his mother. So Joe made his decision. He stood beside his fiancée and told Yelka she needed to step down and let them handle the wedding planning. And she did. Yelka had a stick up her butt over the whole thing and actually avoided speaking to Zandra altogether, but that was totally fine by her. Along with wedding planning, Joe and Zandra were looking for a new place to live. It was important for them to live close to both their families, and they settled on a small apartment within their price range. Zandra and her mother went shopping and bought decorations to make their tiny apartment more homey. Joe and Zandra were so happy, finally a place to call their own. The wedding went smoothly. Yelka kept to herself and didn't cause a scene, but while Joe and Zandra were on their honeymoon in Hawaii, she snuck into their apartment and completely redecorated it. Not just the artwork on the walls. She replaced the bedding, couch covers, curtains, the whole shebang. When they returned home, Zandra was pissed. Joe, on the other hand, basically chuckled and was like, "Yep, that's my mom." Joe may have found it funny, but Zandra was not having that. She went to Yelka herself and told her how inappropriate and intrusive she was. She was not permitted to enter their apartment when they weren't home. But Yelka kept doing it, over and over. Most of the time, they didn't even know she had been there, because she would do things like clean and restock the fridge with food. Zandra thought Joe bought the food, and vice versa. But they eventually figured out that certain products were being swapped out for different varieties, ones that Yelka found superior. Once they realized what was happening, Zandra confronted Yelka. But she explained that she was just simply popping in to drop off groceries that she bought, and it was harmless. Zandra was still very uncomfortable with the whole thing and told Joe that he needed to tell his mother she cannot enter their apartment when they're not home. Joe told Zandra he would, but he never did. What you have to understand here is that Yelka was more than just his mom. She was also his boss. He didn't want to make waves and ruin his chance at taking over the family business. But Yelka took things way too far when she replaced Zandra's wardrobe with new clothes. She literally removed the items that she owned and hung up items she found more appropriate or more flattering in her eyes for Zandra to wear. Seriously, this is beyond controlling behavior. This is just wrong. This is the point I would walk away for sure. Zandra didn't even bother telling Joe about this. She drove straight over to Yelka's, barged inside, and tore into her. She demanded her clothing back and told Yelka she was never allowed inside their apartment again. Do you know what Yelka said? "You don't look good in your clothing. I know what you look good in." So ridiculous. She grudgingly opened a closet door and threw the clothes at Zandra. Zandra drove back home and got into a huge argument with Joe over the whole thing. She was expressing how inappropriate his mother was, and literally in that moment, they heard someone knocking at the apartment door. It was Yelka and her husband, Sam. Zandra was like, "Oh, hell no. Get them out of here." But Yelka was all smiles. She had some exciting news. Her and Sam offered to put a down payment on a house for them. Zandra and Joe looked at each other. Their apartment was teeny tiny. They never imagined they could afford to buy a house. They wanted to start a family together, and the thought of doing that in a 2-story home was a dream. Perhaps this was Yoka's way of apologizing for her behavior. After setting some ground rules, Zandra and Joe agreed. They would allow Yoka and Sam to put down $85,000, and then they would take over the mortgage payments. The next day, Yoka took them to check out the house, and it was very, very close to her house, which slightly alarmed Zandra, but she couldn't back out now, not with the thought of home ownership dangling in front of her. As they were walking around inside, Yoka said, "I can't wait to start decorating." Zandra's heart sank. Nothing was going to change. But at least now they would have a house. She tried to stay positive. After moving in, Zandra made plans to add an accent tile to the kitchen. When Joe mentioned this to his mother, Yoka stormed over and told Zandra no. She already had plans for the kitchen. And as you can guess, this started a huge fight within the Pesic family. Zandra was like, "F this, I'm out." She packed her things and moved in with her mom. But not long after she moved out, Zandra discovered she was pregnant. She decided to try to make her marriage work for the sake of her child. She moved back in with Joe, and he told Yoka she needed to lay off. If she wanted anything to do with her grandchild, she had to obey their boundaries. And she did. Throughout Zandra's pregnancy, Yoka behaved herself. No sneaking into the home or trying to control Zandra. The couple had a boy and named him Brandon. They allowed Yoka and Sam to see him, but only under their supervision. When Brandon was 6 months old, Zandra and Joe decided it was time for a date night. It was Joe's responsibility to book the babysitter. When the babysitter showed up, Zandra's mouth hit the floor. It was Yoka. He did not run this by her. She almost called off date night, but Joe talked her down. He said how respectful she had been, and she just wants some quality time with her grandson. Zandra finally agreed, and they left for dinner. But she couldn't stop this nagging feeling that she just didn't trust Yoka. After dinner, they went out dancing. When they got to the club, Zandra called the house to check in. Yoka says Brandon is fast asleep. She gave him some tea from the old country, and it knocked him out like a light. She gave specific instructions on when and what to feed Brandon, and at this age, he was still only drinking milk. She urged Yoka to tell her what it was that she gave to Brandon, but she said not to worry. They used this tea all the time in Yugoslavia, and nothing bad ever happened. It helped the baby sleep and stay asleep. She rushed back to Joe and said that Yoka had given Brandon something and they needed to get back home ASAP. Brandon was breathing, but barely. Zandra picked him up and he was limp. He couldn't wake up. Yoka was calm as can be, telling Zandra and Joe to relax, everything would be fine. Honestly, how do you not fight Yoka right then and there? Someone hurts my kid like this on purpose, there's hell to pay. Zandra didn't have time for that. She rushed Brandon to the emergency room. They couldn't figure out exactly what Yoka had given him, but they said it was dangerous and he should never ingest it again. They were able to get Brandon awake and breathing normally again. He was released the next day. Enough was enough. Zandra wanted nothing to do with Yoka. She told Joe he had to choose, her or his mother. And for reasons I cannot fathom, Joe seemed to think that Zandra was the one overreacting. This time he told her he chose Yoka. She is just trying to be helpful and supportive. If Zandra can't see that, then he can't be with her anymore. Which is crazy. Good luck finding anyone willing to put up with that bullshit, Joe. He probably thinks he grew up drinking tea from the old country and he turned out just fine. Zandra took Brandon and moved back in with her mother. She filed for a divorce and was seeking full custody. Joe did not take this well, and he was also gunning for full custody of Brandon. Yelka served Zandra papers forbidding her to enter the home without her permission. Ironic, huh? Some of Zandra's belongings were still in the home she once shared with Joe, but at this point, she wrote it off. Good riddance. A judge decided Zandra would have full custody of Brandon, and Joe was to pay child support and alimony. On top of this, the judge decided the house now belonged to Zandra. Because of the stunt Yelka pulled drugging Brandon, she was not allowed to enter the home, and a restraining order was placed. Yes, they paid for the down payment, but the home was in Joe and Zandra's names, and in the divorce, she got the house. Joe and Yelka were stunned. They couldn't believe the turn of events. Joe, with his tail between his legs, moved out, and Zandra moved in. But Joe did not pay his child support and alimony like he was supposed to. Not one single penny. Zandra was upset she wasn't getting the financial support she was owed, but ignored it. It was easier to just let it go. Joe filed appeals, but nothing ever changed due to the fact he wasn't keeping up his end of the bargain. About a year and a half after the divorce was finalized, Zandra got a package in the mail. It was a paperback novel titled The Deaths of Cindy James. She found this very strange. She had no idea who sent it to her. There was no return address. It was a nonfiction novel about the story of a nurse who was harassed for 7 years by an unknown person and then ultimately murdered. This case is still unsolved. She flipped through the pages and noticed there were certain paragraphs highlighted. The highlighted areas were specific things that Cindy James's tormentor did to her. For example, being followed by a car, receiving threatening phone calls, someone lurking outside her home, and a tree in her yard being set on fire. There was one final passage that was about Cindy's death. The only thing that was highlighted read, "You're dead." Now, what would you do if you got something like this in the mail? I'm calling the cops ASAP. Zandra was freaked out, but she wasn't sure what it meant or who sent it. She assumed it was probably just Joe being an ass, and she set it aside and tried not to dwell on it. One evening, she had a friend over. They were catching up at the kitchen table when they heard a noise outside. They looked out the window to see that the tree in her front yard was up in flames. Someone had lit it on fire, just like the highlighted passage from the book. Zandra ran and grabbed the book, flipping to the pages to show her friend what was highlighted. She is officially scared. The fire department put out the fire, and Zandra reported to the police her suspicions of a stalker/tormentor, but unfortunately, there wasn't much they could do. Which I kind of call BS. She has an idea Joe was behind this. They could have kept an eye on him following this incident, but they didn't. At least not at first. After this, the late-night phone calls began. The landline would ring, but no one spoke, just heavy breathing on the other end. Zandra started leaving her phone off the hook overnight so it wouldn't ring. Not only was it terrifying, but it woke up baby Brandon. About a month later, Zandra had given Brandon a bath and went to lay him in his crib. It was dark outside, but she didn't flip the light on, meaning she could see through the window into her backyard. His bedroom was on the first floor. There, standing outside the window, was a man wearing a ski mask. She scooped up Brandon and ran frantically to the phone. As she dialed 911, she heard the man banging on the window and walls of her house, but he was gone by the time police arrived. I can't imagine how scared she felt. I mean, she's a single woman living alone, and someone mails this book, and the highlighted passages are all happening in real life. The next day, Zandra noticed someone tailing her as she drove through town. They didn't do anything, just followed her every move. The scary part is everything in the book has come true except for the last one, the one that read, "You're dead." Zandra kept police informed of all the strange encounters. By this point, they had kept a close eye on Joe. They did not notice any abnormal behavior. They had no idea who could be behind the late-night phone calls and the stranger lurking in the dark. One day, when leaving work at the dental office, Zandra walked out with her coworker, Bernice. She often gave her rides home. Zandra and Bernice jumped into her car. As Zandra started the engine, Bernice bent over to set her purse on the floorboard, and as she did, shots were fired. She stayed down until it stopped. 6 shots in total. She heard a car peeling out and sat up to catch a glimpse. A, quote, flashy red car was speeding away. Bernice looks over to Zandra and sees that she is limp. Her body is lying across the steering wheel. She was hit by 2 of the 6 shots. She flagged down help, but Zandra was pronounced dead at the scene. The 2 shots were in her head, and she died instantly. Joe Pesic was the main suspect in her murder, especially when they broke the news to him that his ex-wife, mother of his son, was killed. He showed 0 emotion. But he had an alibi. He was at the public pool that day, conveniently had a time-stamped receipt to show and all. But my question is, do they stamp it when you leave too? Because who's to say he didn't show up there to create an alibi and then just leave? Police parked outside his parents' house, which is where he was currently living, and they watched him day after day. But nothing changed. It was just his normal routine. He didn't seem to be doing anything shady. Yelka, on the other hand, one day police witnessed her getting into her car. And before she left, another man exited their home and climbed into the back seat. What struck them as weird was that this unidentified man laid down between the seats as if he wanted to avoid being seen. So they decided to follow her. Yelka drove to a mall where she parked, exited, and went inside. A few minutes later, the man crawled out of the car and followed. They were trying really hard not to be seen together. A little while later, Yelka was seen exiting the mall and got back into her car. Just like before, the unknown man followed a few minutes later and hunched down out of sight. She drove back to her home where the man got out of her car and in his own car and drove away. Police did not know what they just witnessed, but something seemed fishy. They followed the unknown man and pulled him over. He was asked to step out of the car. When he did, they noted that his pockets were bulging. $100 bills began flying away in the wind. He had some explaining to do. This man, Milan Nanatic, was a family friend of the Pesics. He knew some shady characters, and Yelka hired him to arrange Zandra's murder. Milan hired hitman David Saganiano. But this wasn't your average job. He was instructed to harass Zandra for months leading up to the murder. David was the one calling Zandra's home and sneaking around outside, following her car, and who set her tree on fire. Yelka was a true crime fanatic like the rest of us, and she was obsessed with the story of Cindy James. She wanted Zandra to suffer like Cindy did. Yelka drove Milan to withdraw $30,000 in cash to pay for the hit on Zandra. Milan would then split the money with David. Milan Nanatic spilled the beans to the police. He, David Saganiano, and Yelka were all arrested for the murder of Alexandra Pesic. And Zandra was just 25 years old. All 3 people involved were tried and convicted of murder in 1993. The sentencing for murder in Canada is life in prison, but we all know life doesn't mean life. They are eligible for parole after 25 years. Brandon was not handed over to Joe, thankfully. I know he was never formally charged with anything, but I find it hard to believe that he knew nothing of his mother's plans. Brandon was not allowed anywhere near that side of the family. He was raised by Zandra's mother. If you're doing the math, that 25 years has passed. In fact, Yelka's lawyer petitioned for an early release just after 16 years because she was ill. She has never showed any remorse for what she did, and her appeal was denied. You shouldn't be allowed out just because you're sick. You arranged the murder of another human being. Healthy or ill, you should be locked up until you die. As far as I can tell in my research, she is still alive and in prison. Thank you so much for tuning in to Killer Stories. Follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Killer Stories Podcast, and I'm on Twitter at Killer Story Pod. If you are enjoying the show, I would be forever grateful if you could leave a rating on Spotify and or leave a written review on Apple Podcasts. If you would like to support the show, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/killerstories. The best compliment is to share the podcast with your true crime-loving friends. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a Killer Story.